And just to start off by kind of situating this discussion a bit, and I think this is kind of relevant, I think, for this morning's conversation as well, is that one of the features, I think, of this conversation is that it's been going on for a long time. So this is a newspaper article from 1986 talking about the ability of an eye examination to lead to early diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, raising this question of who wants to know. It's a question that's persisted through the identification of the ApoE risk alleles in the early 1990s, and then that came to the fore again around through the marketing of companies like 23andMe. It's a recurrent feature of newspaper articles in the UK. The Daily Mail particularly is particularly fond of this question. This article here is from the New York Times, which also revisits this question periodically, and it's a question that hasn't really that's neither been resolved nor is going away. So this is a quote at the bottom here from an interview from a study that I'm doing at the moment around digital health technologies and around the use of digital tools to detect early cognitive change. And again, it comes back to this question very similar in 2020 to in 1986 of the question, why would you want to know early and what would you do about that? And obviously this is kind of fundamentally a question for bioethics, but also for the social sciences, I think, as well, around balancing questions around the right to know, the value of risk information for things like personalized prevention, and then balancing that with things like the lack of actionability, the lack of clinical utility among asymptomatic individuals, related to that questions about whether if something doesn't have clinical utility, it can possibly have personal utility, uncertainty, and above all, the potential, or as a consequence, the potential for this information to cause harm. So, as I mentioned, this is a question that's persisted for over 30 years, and it's inevitably been the subject of significant research attention, particularly around ApoE. And I think that because this is literature that we haven't heard about yet today, but I think there is this interesting empirical literature around the impacts of communicating Alzheimer's disease risk to asymptomatic individuals. And this is the findings of a systematic review we did a couple of years ago around ApoE result communication, which finds that it doesn't cause distress among the majority of people who don't already have a major anxiety or depressive disorder and who display an interest in genetic testing. So a kind of qualified finding. But most of this data, as many of you will already know, comes from a series of studies called the REVEAL studies. So I think it's 4 to date, randomized trials of the return of ApoE information and now of amyloid information as well, across asymptomatic populations, across populations with mild cognitive impairment, and trialing different ways of returning that information to people. But as I tried to show in that first bullet, the findings of REVEAL are among a very distinctive population, those who've already been screened for anxiety and depressive disorders, and those who've expressed some interest. And they're also US based, and I think there was a really important point made earlier about the fact that the way in which that we identify people as being at risk, the way that we communicate that information back, and then what we do about that information is very dependent on individual national health systems and national social and cultural contexts around questions like stigma. Those studies also focused primarily on the short-term psychological effects, so anxiety, depression. So my bullets have started coming in a peculiar order, but they did find that over time, so that one of the impacts was that people did, there was a suggestion, particularly in the United States, that people did increase their uptake of long-term care, and that there was some evidence of behavior change, particularly around the use of supplements. But that a small percentage of people did experience psychological effects, even amongst that pre-screened population. And that interestingly, for some, there was a nocebo effect in that people experienced cognitive decline, seemingly as a result of receiving risk information. People expressed fears about employment discrimination. And then one of the things that hasn't been captured in things like the REVEAL study is what the consequences of this information are, or what the value is of this information over time. One interesting small qualitative study from Doris Dahlem shows that for the majority of people who received their ApoE genotype, over time it became seen as valuable, but that for some people it did have a lasting negative effect. So that existing body of evidence provided the background for work that we did in the ACAR study, Approaches to the Communication of Alzheimer's Disease Risk. And this study was a sub-study of a larger European project called EPAD, the European Prevention of Alzheimer's Dementia Consortium. And so EPAD was a clinical trial platform established to facilitate faster secondary prevention studies. So clinical trials aimed at people with either mild forms of cognitive impairment or who are asymptomatic. And it involved two contexts, which for us as a research group around the ethical, legal and social implications, presented questions around disclosure. So one was that the study involved a longitudinal cohort study, which collected a lot of the information that one would use to generate a personalized risk score. And secondly, because it involved a clinical trial platform that would recruit people based on biomarker or risk profiles, it created a context in which that information potentially would be fed back to people as part of genotype or phenotype driven recruitment. So what we set out to ask was, what did older people involved in dementia research expect would be the implications of learning their dementia risk? And secondly, for our practical consideration as well, what expectations would they have of how the process of disclosing those results looked like? What I'm going to focus on here is the first of those questions. So the study was a qualitative focus group study, and it was based in the UK and Spain, led by myself and my colleague Ana Diaz from Alzheimer Europe. And we also conducted a focus group as well with the European Working Group of People with Dementia, which focused in particular on how people would have liked to have been told about their diagnosis and about risk status. Among the groups in Spain and the UK, which were conducted with people without any cognitive impairment, there were 51 participants in those across 8 groups. And we provided people before the groups with background information on the move to prevention and the potential different ways in which they might receive their risk, or potential different bases on which they might receive risk information, including ApoE, including amyloid, and including a lifestyle or behavior, a lifestyle risk assessment based on the CADE tool. We then did a thematic analysis across the 2 language data sets around a shared structured protocol. What we found was that I think very much in the same way as Perla just described, that the discussion was strongly influenced by people's family experiences of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So people already felt that they were at risk because of family history often, and that because of and that their experiences with parents or other family members shaped how they then talked about risk. And there was this recurrent discussion across both contexts, interestingly, of the sword of Damocles as being this kind of thing that was hanging over them as they got older. Most people in the groups, in line with what's been found elsewhere in survey studies, expressed interest in learning their risk status, saying things like information's good, it puts the problem on the table, or information's king. But they didn't necessarily feel that as a group involved in research and particularly invested in this area, that their views were typical. But what we were particularly interested in our work was about understanding the nature of risk and how people live with it. And this quote from one of the UK groups kind of gets to the heart of that. The idea that you're not going to have an attack of Alzheimer's. It's more of it's a living with situation, which sometimes heart disease can be, but sometimes you don't get the option of living with it. In that it can be rapidly terminal. So this fits with the kind of literature in medical sociology, which describes the risk experience as risk not being as something that occurs at a moment, but is something that is lived out over a long period of time. And I think that this is one of the things that we were hoping to add in this study to this existing literature that looks around these questions of anxiety, depression, uses things like the impact of event scales, which measure fairly short-term effects of information. And so in this paper, which is published in Sociology of Health and Illness, we describe this risk experience in 3 stages: as living at risk, as living with risk, and then as living beyond risk. And so what I want to do is to just give you a flavour of what this means in terms of how we might think about what people do with this information. So the first is living at risk, and here we're particularly thinking about, I think, what you kind of classically expect in terms of the return of biomarker or other types of risk information, things that people might say that they would do now in order to modify or head off this risk. And dealing with the new knowledge that's been given to them. So the first one, obviously, again, as Perla mentioned, is this idea of reducing risk. So here, it's important to know your risk in order to be able to act, even if there's nothing even if there's no medication. If there were things like diet or environment you can do, then these are still things that you can do. And this is interesting because this is one of the promises, I think, of the personalized prevention program. But at the same time, we know from studies of genetic risk information and other interventions where people are simply provided with information about their risk, that it's a fairly blunt instrument in terms of behavior change, and that actually it doesn't necessarily have a great deal of effect unless it's accompanied by a wider package of tools. And this is recognized. This is one of the values of doing these things in focus groups, is that people always say, I would change my diet, I would do more exercise. And then other people always come back and say things like this. So what are we going to change? Do we eat better? But we already do that, or we should. Do we exercise more? We should do it. What are we going to change? And you'll not change anything, I think, honestly. So this recognition that actually these are often things that we already know that we need to do, but that we don't necessarily do. The other thing that people talked about in terms of a kind of response to risk and what you do about heading off this at-risk status is the discussion of preemptive suicide. And again, this is something that's been discussed a lot across genetic testing. And there's a real question about how much one can read from kind of hypothetical discussions in terms of what actually happens. But people talking about, I want to know immediately, even if it's a risk of 80%, even if it's not 99%, even if there's some uncertainty associated, to make my own decisions. And again, for this participant, it's very much shaped by her experience of caring for her mother. The second quality of this risk experience that people were imagining and narrating in these focus groups was that of living with risk. So rather than necessarily the immediate impact of risk on them, it's about imagining what a life with their risk would look like, incorporating their ideas of risk into their lives. And there were 2 real components of this. The first, which we describe as informal vigilance. So this kind of constantly keeping an eye out on in how you live your life and how you conduct with your relationships with others and your work. So I would be looking for the signs of it, and I'm bad enough as it is. A feeling that in that discussion of informal vigilance as well, that it wouldn't just be an individual looking out for themselves, but it would be their family and their colleagues who are keeping an eye on them and kind of noticing things about them. But it's also a kind of a formal process as well. The idea that if you know your risk, then you can be monitored through to diagnosis, that you therefore, just by the virtue of knowing your risk, which isn't itself a diagnosis, that you enter a kind of healthcare relationship as a consequence of that. And then finally, people talking about living beyond risk. So this one, we talk about, these were conversations in which people took risk as not necessarily being what we might think of some kind of probabilistic prediction about the future, but as being a certainty, and about considering what they do now, what they would do now and in the future because of this certain arrival of future dementia. What the sociologists Higgs and Gillard describe as the event horizon of dementia, beyond which you're no longer seen as being the same person as before. And so people talk about planning for themselves and others in terms of what they would reorient now in anticipation of the end of them as they see themselves at the moment. So talking about spending more time with family and being with them and doing as much as possible with them at the moment. People also talked about the importance of things like putting in place power of attorneys, enabling people to continue to act for them, even when they were physically present, but no longer cognitively present in their view. So, what I've tried to pull out in this kind of overview of the work that we've done was about, so one of the interesting things was that we had these kind of similar conversations in the UK and Spain, which was fascinating, particularly the kind of persistence of particular tropes like the sword of Damocles. We've started to explore, I think, the fact that learning one's Alzheimer's disease risk has this kind of medium and long-term future consequences and effects. And that actually what's interesting when you compare this around, when you situate this in relation to the kind of discussion of what's of the kind of concern about harms, it's no longer entirely clear which aspects of these are benefits or harms, but that nevertheless they are disruptions to our lives and that need understanding and potentially supporting. And that one of the things that really comes out strongly through our group discussions was around these kind of future relationships, both with families and colleagues and work, but also with healthcare providers, and that these are things that need to be incorporated into the development of preventative programs. So that's thanks to all the people who are involved in the research, and I'm happy to share these slides with some of the references to the work that we'll be discussing. Thank you.